Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me all right? Good. On behalf of the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, or GEFI, as we'll be calling it from here on in, a very warm welcome to the magnificent surroundings of the Adam Smith Business School here in Glasgow University. And to our session this morning, where we'll be exploring how faith-inspired investment can contribute to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and reaching a net zero economy. It's a great pleasure to have so many of you joining us here in person this morning. And we also have, I'm pleased to say, quite a large global audience online. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Graham Burnside, and I'm currently a senior advisor to GEFI, as well as being one of its co-founders. So firstly, to say a little about GEFI itself, we are a not-for-profit organisation dedicated principally to unlocking the necessary finance to achieve the SDGs. This morning's event forms part of our Faith in the SDGs work stream within our Path to COP26 campaign, and it follows on from our Islamic finance programme, which we held last week up at Ross Priory on the beautiful shores of Loch Lomond, where we were unusually lucky with the weather, I'm delighted to say, and we're in partnership with the Islamic Finance Council UK and HM Treasury, we announced the formation of a new high-level working group on green sukuk. And if anybody doesn't know what that means and would like to know more, then speak to one of us afterwards. We also worked with Gatehouse Bank, who are represented here this morning, to launch a reporting and disclosures guidance note for Islamic banks signing up to the UN principles of responsible banking. While FaithInvest, our partner organisation this morning, also joined us to host a conversation with climate investment funds looking at strategies and innovations for mobilising faith-based institutional capital for the just transition. So before we move on, there's just a couple of housekeeping points I need to deal with. Firstly, for those of you attending here in person, please note that there are no fire drills planned during this session, so if the alarm does sound, take it seriously and make your way out via the nearest fire exit. I'm reasonably hopeful that's not going to happen. Glasgow University has stood for quite a while, and I'm hoping it'll see us through the next hour and a half. Secondly, refreshments on my left, your right, will remain available throughout the session. We don't want this to be too terribly formal, so please feel free just to go up whenever and help yourself. Though I'm sorry to say to those of you gazing in longingly from afar that those online will have to arrange their own refreshments. Finally, to everyone here and online, please feel free to share your thoughts as we go along with other delegates and indeed the wider world via Twitter at Finance for Change, that's Finance Figure for Change, using the hashtag Path to COP26, if you do such things. So could I also say that we are most grateful to FaithInvest, WahidInvest and the Islamic Finance Council UK for supporting the whole of our Faith in the SDGs work stream. So, the running order this morning, well, we will shortly have the pleasure of a keynote address, which I shall come back to in a second. That will be followed by what is described as a fireside chat, an interview, which will be hosted and moderated by Lorna Gold of FaithInvest, featuring Lord Alderdice and Umar Suleiman of WahidInvest. Then we'll move on to a panel session, which I will be moderating, and we'll have 4 speakers, which I will introduce at the time. And then we will finally conclude with a further keynote from Martin Palmer, the CEO of FaithInvest. So that's the running order. And I'm now delighted to welcome and hand over to Lord Wallace, the current moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, who is going to give us his thoughts. Thank you.
Graham, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'm relieved to have got here, train delayed. But many thanks to, I was going to say, Global Ethical Finance Initiative, or GEFI, as we were told to say for the rest of the morning, for the invitation to address you at the outset of this Faith in SDGs summit, when I was asked to talk about the role of faith groups in promoting climate justice as the country rebuilds and how faith-based finance can help to advance a net zero economy. I was thinking about this, it came to mind that when I was recently moving house in Orkney into a smaller house, and one which is far more environmentally sustainable than an old 19th century old Church of Scotland manse. I'm a great hoarder. We had 38 years of things to sort out. And what I did find were my original savings bank books from Annan Savings Bank, which shows that my parents started an account for me when I was probably just weeks, if not days old. Now, you may think, well, what's the significance of that? Other than Annan, along with Airdrie, were the only two savings banks in Scotland that didn't actually go into the Trustees Savings Bank. But probably more significant was that Annan Savings Bank received the accounts of Ruthwell Savings Bank when it closed. And those of historians, financial historians among you, will know that the Ruthwell Bank was founded as a parish bank in 1810 by the Reverend Henry Duncan, a man of faith who wanted to encourage what he called the industrious poor to save for times of hardship. It was run by voluntary trustees, and from that very small acorn grew the worldwide savings bank movement. A shining example, perhaps, of the impact on financial services started as an act of faith to assist poor people. But times change, and it's worth remembering that the potential of a simple faith-based initiative, if we feel daunted by the challenge before us today, that nevertheless consider how that faith-based initiative did actually manage to develop, and how we should consider how faith-based financial initiatives might help advance net zero economy. I want to start by thinking of just what is the importance of the faith dimension in this time where we are discussing the COP. I believe that the whole issue of climate change and the issues at stake in the negotiations currently going on in this city ought to have a faith dimension. I think there are three immediate faith-based reasons. I believe our responsibility as people of faith is to exercise stewardship in relation to creation. God created, and God saw that it was good. But a bit like the prodigal son in the parable, we've squandered our inheritance, and now we must return to our Creator in a spirit of contrition and seek to put right our relationship with the Creator and with creation. And linked to that is our relationship with our global neighbours. Pope Francis, in his encyclical before the Paris COP in 2015, I thought summed it up very neatly when he said, everything is interconnected, and that genuine care for our own lives and our relationship with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. So here we have the needs of the global south coming up and interconnecting with the responsibility of the global north. The needs of those who have contributed little or nothing to the human action which has given rise to climate change, and those of us who over many generations have benefited from industrial development. And of course, in trying to address that responsibility of ours, of the wealthier nations, we are looking at in these negotiations at issues such as adaptation funds, of loss and damage fund, the moral obligation which will flow from our command to love our neighbour. The third element of a faith dimension, which I want to say more about later, is that through faith, we can actually say that there is another way. To coin a phrase of a politician some years ago, there is, or to reverse it, there is an alternative. The Multi-Faith Declaration, which was signed by faith leaders not just in Scotland but throughout the United Kingdom ahead of the Glasgow COP, calls on us to be advocates for justice, and that we should do so, call upon governments, upon businesses, and others who exercise power and influence to give proper effect to the Paris Agreement and to make the transition to a just and green economy a priority. But interestingly, in the way the multi-faith agreement is set out, that comes third when we're asked as to what we should commit ourselves to. And it comes third after a commitment to respond to the challenge of climate change by ourselves reflecting deeply in prayer, in meditation, and in worship, and to discern how to care for each other and for creation. And it also commits us to make transformational changes in our own lives and in the lives of our community through individual and collective action. And the multi-faith agreement was proclaimed in a prayer vigil in George Square, proclaimed in the public square here in Glasgow, a week past Sunday, with people, I think, of about 9 or 10 different faiths. Not only was the declaration read out, but actually there was then prayers led by on behalf of 9 faiths and beliefs. And the figure I have seen is that 82% of the world's population profess some allegiance to a faith. That's quite a significant power if we all come together and push that collective power that we have. I suspect it's the one which no politician would lightly ignore. I accept as you look to investment decisions, it's not easy. I don't pretend for a moment that this is easy. In any event, those responsible for managing funds, for trustees, financial advisors, have to do a balancing act as to what the different needs of their respective clients are. Do you want to have a steady income flow, a safe income flow, for example, if you're having to pay salaries? Or do you want to have investments which will lead to significant capital growth? These are perfectly day-by-day decisions that people have to make. But what we're also saying is that there's another layer. I would argue it's an important layer of complexity to have regard to ethical considerations. Over the years, that has been done in many cases in respect of investments in tobacco companies or armaments companies. And today the issue is around investment in companies which produce or make profit from fossil fuels. To invest, or to stay invested, or to disinvest. And I can see there's conflicting arguments and considerations there. Staying in, can you, by staying in, exercise influence from within? And if you get out, what happens to the shareholdings that you've surrendered? Might they be bought up by a sovereign wealth fund or other investors who don't have the same ethical scruples as you have just given up these? Has the overall cause therefore been advanced? In the Church of Scotland, this was an issue which was hotly debated at our General Assemblies in 2018 and 2019. The view of the Kirk's investment trustees favoured selective investment in companies which were assessed by expert agencies as having aligned their strategies with the tighter Paris Agreement. On the contrary, others argued that it was wrong to hold shares in any company which engaged in or profited from producing fossil fuels. The trustees' line was endorsed, albeit by a very narrow margin, in 2018 and then in 2019. And because of COVID, a very foreshortened General Assembly online in 2020 didn't actually address the matter. But earlier this year, 2021, the trustee investment managers deemed that on financial grounds that they decided that the 3 oil companies of which there were investments were no longer attractive, and therefore they sold their remaining interests. And so by the time we came to the General Assembly in May, there were no such fossil fuel investments. And the General Assembly welcomed that fact, and that any future investment of that nature could only be done following agreement between the Church of Scotland's Investors Trust and the Kirk's Faith Impact Forum that there was indeed good evidence that the strategy and implementation of any such company was aligned with stringent targets set by the Paris Agreement. Moreover, a special committee was established to work out what the best framework was for future investment decisions which involved the ethics of investment practice, and that will report to the General Assembly in 2023, growing much wider than just carbon-related industries. But the Church also agreed that it would try to have the ambition of using the Net Zero 2030 framework to develop our plans and to work towards that. I don't think we should be under any illusion how challenging that is. Some of you who frequent Kirk buildings will know that they're not the most energy efficient in the world. Someone told me the other day that we actually own more listed buildings in Scotland than Historic Environment Scotland. So there's a real challenge there. But the challenge is also opportunities because of the things that have to be done in terms of promoting energy efficiency, in terms of what kind of things can be done, which can create employment, because of course it is important. And in Scotland we know this because for so many years parts of the country have benefited from people who have been employed in the oil and gas industry, and it is important that there is a fair transition from those who have been employed in fossil fuel-based industries. So there are investment opportunities in renewables, in energy efficiency, in trying to look to the future as to, I mean, we know the aviation industry knows that it cannot continue as it's doing at the moment, and it must actually adapt and transform itself. And there are surely investment opportunities there in R&D as they do so. I recall that when the grants were first introduced for solar panels, they were at such a level to try and get to stimulate the market, so much so that they had to reduce the grants because everyone was then investing in it, and the cost of solar energy fell, likewise with the production of wind, both onshore and offshore. But I think there's something more fundamental where the role of faith is important. As I said, there must be another way, an alternative to a structure, an economic structure, which depends on ever-growing consumer demands and consumption. If we are to create a kind of society in which we can become carbon neutral, in which we sustain ourselves as carbon neutral, then that has implications for lifestyles and, above all, for values. If there are costs to be borne, then there is a need for education as to why that is the case. There is a need to connect, to be able to bring home to people what the reality is for those who are suffering already the impacts of climate change. And here I think the values of faith are very important. The parable of the sheep and goats is probably familiar to most, if not all of us here. And I always think at the end when the people say to Jesus, when did we see you sick, or when did we see you hungry, when did we see you needing shelter, or when did we see you in prison? What is said to them is not that the things they did was for Jesus or because of Jesus. It's said that because you did it to Jesus. And that's quite a profound statement, because the converse is also true, that when you fail to do it, you failed to do it to Jesus. The dispossessed, the people who have been devastated through flood, the people who are hungry because of famine brought about by extreme weather conditions, the people who thirst because of drought, each and every one of them bears the face of Jesus. And if we don't do it, if we don't take the action, then we don't do it, and Jesus suffers because of our failure. And if we're going to make it more feasible and more attractive to change investment patterns, then I think we need to change the public climate on climate change, in the same way as we probably did and possibly did on tobacco. When I first became a Member of Parliament in 1983 and had to travel regularly between the Northern Isles and London, it was the back 4 seats, certainly in the small planes from Orkney to Edinburgh, which were non-smoking. By the time I left the Scottish Parliament 24 years later, we had implemented a ban on smoking in public places. We can actually change. Change the climate. And I also believe there's a limit to political action. Martin Luther King said that morality can't be legislated for, but behaviour can be regulated. Judicial decrees, he said, may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. Of course, behaviour can be regulated through laws, through rules, for example, on proper and more transparent accounting, so that assessment of companies' strategies and their behaviours can be more readily assessed. And in the Anglican Communion's Climate Resilience and Just Financing, there is a quote from a gentleman, Gus Speth, who's a former chair of the UN Development Group and founder as president of the World Resources Institute. And he says, and I quote, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems, but I was wrong." He's going on to say the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And he went on to conclude, he said, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And may I dare say that neither do financial gurus, fund managers, or bankers. But faith communities may well be able to do that, do something about it. From a faith perspective, there is another way. There is the education in reality. There is the recognition, too, that we must engage and take on board properly, with proper consultation, those who are most vulnerable and those who are most affected. I was involved in the Poverty Truth Commission in Scotland about 11 years ago, where what we said there in terms of poverty was that nothing about us without us is for us. And I think that's absolutely something we should bear in mind too when thinking about how we deal with this issue with Indigenous people and with communities on the front line, that they must be engaged. And as faith communities, and particularly my own faith community, is that love is the thing that can make a difference. Love for God, love for creation, love for our neighbours. That's what can change hearts, because love, I believe, in the public square is justice, and in this case, climate justice. Love and a clear commitment to help the poor is at the core of the Christian message. The values are not exclusively to Christianity, but the values set out in the Edinburgh Finance Declaration of stewardship, love of neighbour, human flourishing, sustainability and purposefulness, justice and equity, common good. These are all the values which are essential if we're going to sustain lifestyles which will allow us to move towards and then sustain a carbon neutral economy. And we need to work alongside others who share these values to bring about individual and collective transformation of our lifestyles and the values on which our lifestyles are based. That may be the best route to ensuring that we can achieve a faith-based finance which will help make necessary advances towards a net zero economy. I very much doubt whether when he set up that small savings bank in Rothwell in 1810, Henry Duncan foresaw the impact that his actions would have. But from a small beginning, rooted in faith and with a commitment to the poor, he showed that that can have a transformational effect. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to invite our two speakers who are going to join me for a fireside chat to come up to the stage. So that's Lord Alderdice and Umar Suleiman. You're very welcome.
Thank you. No.
So first of all, a huge thank you to Lord Wallace for that very stimulating keynote address. I think you have really framed the discussion for us this morning and brought us very much to the heart of where we need to be focused in terms of this important debate. We are here as part of a side event in the context of COP26. I think it's very clear from the rhetoric and from the policy discussions and from what's already been agreed that public finance is not going to get us where we need to be to deliver the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals in the short space of 9 years. At the same time, I have to say that public-private partnerships, as currently framed in many parts of the world, are very unlikely to get us to where we need to be in time to deliver the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. So where's the alternative? And I think that, Lord Wallace, you talked about an alternative. And I think that's one of the questions I want to put to our guests shortly. Is there one alternative? Is there many alternatives? How do we, as a configuration of faith communities, in a sense, move forward with alternative values, facing a system that tends to only recognize one set of dominant values? So it's something, a problem, a tactical problem, perhaps, we face looking at this complex issue of public finance, private finance, blended finance, and third sector, or like, is there a third sector there somewhere amongst faith communities? But before I come on to all of this, I have to introduce the two guests. So Lord Alderdice, you'll be very well known to many people in this room. You're a research fellow, a senior research fellow in the Harris Manchester College in Oxford, and the director of the Centre for Resolution of Intractable Conflict. You have played a key role behind the scenes over many, many decades in the Northern Ireland peace process. You were Deputy President, then President of the Association Liberal International. And we could say many more things, but you're so welcome to be here this morning, and we look forward to hearing from you. And then Umar Suleiman, you are...
Should have introduced me first, because how am I supposed to do that?
Not at all, not at all. You are General Manager of Wahid Investment, and you might tell us a little bit more specifically about Wahid Investment. You have decades, 15 years it says here, of regulatory risk advisory roles across different financial firms, including HSBC, Dewey Capital Management and EY. You've advised many startups, fintechs, worked in the space of Islamic endowments. You're an economic and business advisor to the Islamic Council of Europe. So you're both really welcome, and we have such a diverse expertise as well with you here. So I wanted to start with you, Lord Alderdice. We heard from Lord Wallace that there's a great need to, in a sense, revive that spirit. You talked about the men of faith who started savings banks, who, I mean, if you think the whole history of banking in Scotland and internationally, faith communities, faith leadership was really at the heart of that. In the current context, what role do you believe that faith asset owners have to play in delivering the SDGs? And I think importantly, how do you feel, how does the financial sector, what can the financial sector learn from faiths?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind welcome, and thanks very much to Lord Wallace, to Jim Wallace, a very good and very old friend, for his quite inspiring introduction in this very historic setting. And when we look back, as he did and as you've done, to achievements that there have been, we can't sit in a place like this and not remember Adam Smith. And you can't have an Irishman here, an Irish Presbyterian, who doesn't also mention Francis Hutcheson, who of course was his inspiration. But those people had a real conflict, a very real conflict within the Christian church. So we may celebrate them now, but there were many people in the Christian church, and Protestant church particularly, who wanted rid of them because they were trying to confront challenges. And over the years, that kind of issue has arisen again and again. So in 1910, for example, we had the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, which was really the trigger for the more formal ecumenical movement. not well received by lots of people within the Christian community who wanted to stay. We have a political party at home that you'll know is called Sinn Féin, which is Irish for ourselves alone. But many people on the Protestant side are just as much Sinn Féiners as people on the Republican side. Ourselves alone. And indeed, one could make an argument that although much was achieved in the ecumenical movement, it really ran out of momentum. Now, of course, Edinburgh is remembered in this body of people for the Edinburgh Declaration, financial declaration, which was an interfaith declaration. It moved beyond ecumenism into interfaith conversation. But similarly, I don't think that we should assume this is going to be easy. And one of the things I would just caution against is the idea that those of us of faith are the ones that have the way of resolving this problem to preach out to those in the financial community. Because actually, there's quite a lot of difficulty within the faith communities, each of them on their own, and even more, each of them together with the others. And if we're going to be able to make a contribution to people in other aspects of our society and economy, then there's going to have to be a lot more conversation within the faith communities and between the faith communities. And that's why I think the idea of the cultural development and the cultural leadership that Lord Wallace was talking about is really very important. There's a real struggle that we need to go through to achieve that. Now, if we do that, in the process of doing that, we will be involving people in the faith communities who are working in finance. We were talking to one or two colleagues this morning about that, who are working in these areas. And it won't be so much a kind of modern day missionary movement where the faith communities go to the finance world and go to others and say, now you need to understand, you've got to do something about climate and this and that and the other thing. It's not like that. Missionary work isn't like that anymore anywhere. It's a matter of saying, let's work together, let's have conversation, let's, in the words of an old friend of mine, Ed Shapiro, let's ask the question, the person I disagree with, what is he right about? Not what is he wrong about, we could write volumes about that. What is he right about, so that we enter a conversation where we can move forward. And Lord Wallace pointed out some of the challenges, the physical, financial challenges of old church buildings, and that's true of other faiths as well. So for me, that's the challenge, to get into a conversation that will take us forward rather than us having all the answers to preach out to others.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I have to get a plug in here for FaithInvest, because that's exactly why the organisation was set up. Not to advise faiths in the sense of financial advice, but to be the space that holds some of those finance-related conversations amongst different faith groups, because that space needs to be held. But I think, Umar, coming to you, I think there's a balance almost, I see, between working at an interfaith level or a multi-faith level, and then each faith themselves going deeper into their own values and coming up with solutions coherent with their own values, and almost being a lighthouse for other faiths and learning from each other in a very practical way of how do you do this, rather than having the important philosophical conversations. You're the general manager of Wahid Investments.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate, or what's the kind of articulation of Islamic principles, values, and financial principles in the work that you're doing with Wahid?
Sure. I mean, without kind of promoting Wahid, I think it's important to understand when we talk about the situation that we're in currently, and we look at faith versus non-faith players, the biggest challenge, I think, is against materialism and unbridled greed and capitalism. And this is part of a journey. This is something that we're living right now, where it's growth upon growth. And the challenge for anyone of faith and non-faith is dealing with this, because it's so easy now to access credit, buy now, pay later. It's constantly fed in. And for me and the work that I'm doing, actually, it's from our faith as well. There's a principle which is the prevention of harm takes precedence over a perceived benefit. I just want everyone to think about that. The prevention of harm takes precedence over a perceived benefit. Now, often the discussion we have, and when we talk about social finance, is how can we help a situation? How can we help people who need, various aid and so on and so forth? but actually it's taking it back to what are the causes, what's the root of a lot of the societal ills that we have. And one of the issues is interest-based debt. The amount of debt we're living through, it's hugely problematic, and debt is a form of slavery. And so despite the facade of freedom, we're actually enslaved to debt in various forms. Now, capitalism itself is fairly agnostic. So it responds to what the market wants. And so for us, part of my mission, and I would say this generally, is around financial literacy, people understanding the role that they play, having less greed, such a simple thing. Do we always need everything that we want? And it's fulfilling our wants rather than our needs has caused us, and whether it's done on a micro level or a macro level. When you look at the consumption of the planet produces enough to feed everyone. Yet not everyone is fed. We're happy to destroy mounds of food, let it rot, than to help people or give people that food. And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. So I think we need to look at the whole value chain, the whole supply chain, and we need to take a step back and look what are the mechanisms that we're using today that has put us in this place. And for us, we've definitely identified interest-based debt as that. And the thing is, people aren't having this discussion about the role of interest in society. The Islamic faith is still pushing this, but it's something that's shared across all faiths, actually, that interest. And if you look at the Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, the only time he actually became violent was to whom? The moneylenders. The moneylenders. So he was a man of love. This was the message of love and peace. But he became violent when it came to the moneylenders. Yet we aren't really having that discussion. So there is an onus on us to re-look back. And this is why we say, look at the cause of the harms and address them if you want to achieve a better outcome. Otherwise, what you're going to have is just structured products that on the face of it seem like they're doing better. And actually what it does, it makes us feel better. So we can go back to living the lives that we live. As long as we give some charity, we feel better with ourselves, and we can protect ourselves from it. And so what we're doing at Wahid is to try and change the narrative and look at actually moving away from interest-based debt.
Thanks. That's a very interesting point there. Just coming back to you, Lord Alderdice, I was out on the march on Saturday. I have to say it was very therapeutic, shouting at the top of my lungs in the pouring rain. Felt I was doing something for climate justice. But somebody had a placard that went global. It really went viral on Saturday. And it said, it was a quote from Chico Mendes, and it says, "Environmentalism without struggle is just gardening." And I thought it was great because there's this kind of tension when we talk about ESG. When we talk about ESG, that the S gets forgotten. So environmental, social, and governance factors in our investing. So how do we, like we're talking here about the SDGs, it's about the marriage of the struggle for a livable future in terms of a climate, but also the social justice issues that underpin that. How do you see the faiths engaging with the ESG movement in a way to ensure that those are, like as Lord Wallace mentioned, Pope Francis, that these two kind of sides of the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, are both kept in balance together?
Well, I think in many ways, Umar demonstrated this in exactly what he said, because he pointed out that for many people in the Muslim community, this whole question of how our society is structured is unjust and unsustainable. And in many ways, the Christian community, which has been the more powerful community in geopolitical terms, has kind of forgotten that or parceled it off. And so it seems to me that a really substantial and thoroughgoing conversation in interfaith dialogue on these issues threatens, and I use that word advisedly, threatens to open up the question for people in Christendom if we engage properly with our Muslim colleagues. For them too, there are challenges as they engage with us, because in the Muslim world, there are also all sorts of problems which are not able to be resolved by the Muslim world on its own. So I think you're right, it is a sort of relief to get out and be able to hold a placard and give off about it, and it's very therapeutic. And that's a good thing to do if it then gives you the passion to reflect on your own contribution to these things, not just in terms of practical things that you might do, but also in the narrative, the understanding, the culture, the way of being in the world of your whole community. And ultimately, that now means the global community. And we cannot do this without each other. The big failing at the end of the Cold War was that we turned to Russia, and instead of saying, we've a chance to build a new world order, but we can't do it without you, we said, now do you understand your system failed? Ours was successful. We missed a huge opportunity to build a new world order. We have that possibility now because of the climate crisis. And we need to grasp the opportunity with both hands, but with both arms around each other.
Thank you.
Fantastic response, and very, very inspiring. I maybe come to the last question to you both now. After the COP, I mean, we're going to come to the end of this week, I feel, and people will be scratching their heads, saying, is it a success or is it a failure? So many people are asking me already, do you think it's a success or failure? And I think there's high on rhetoric, as I said, but the substance of it. So there's going to be a kind of question mark over, are we doing enough? And one of the statistics, I have to say, that's been repeated to me, it was also repeated this morning from various different forums. It's strange that 80% of the world's population belong to a faith community. I think that this is one of those statistics that's entering the ether in terms of the climate world and the Sustainable Development Goals. So at the end of this week, thinking at the end of COP, what one thing, Umar, starting with you, would you like to see faith asset owners doing after COP in order to step up the engagement of faiths in financing the SDGs?
There's a lot of things that we need to do, and I think that the one message I would say is that we need to move away from proselytizing and to start doing. And we need to be the example that we want from other people. And that means actually doing. I think we've spoken about this, we understand it. We need to take it back to our communities, whatever those communities are, however we measure them, and tell them it's making the small changes. Everyone often talks about the butterfly effect in a negative way. But you know, a butterfly flaps its wings halfway across the world and there's a hurricane. But actually it can work the opposite way as well. So a small change, it's just turning the dial. If everyone does it a little bit, then there'll be a huge impact. And I think it's for us to go back and educate our communities about making those small changes, not because you have to, because someone's going to tell you from some form of regulator, but because you want to. And that's them understanding that this is our collective planet. It's our home that we share, and we want to maintain it for each other and ourselves.
Thank you. John?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of things for me. The first is your statistic. If 80% of the population of the world have a commitment to faith, then people of faith bear the responsibility for the mess we're in. Because they're the overwhelming majority.
Very good point.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, one of the great lessons of the Scottish Enlightenment was that if we scientifically analyse things down into their individual components, we can learn a great deal and achieve a great deal. And in a way, that's what the SDGs do. The 17 SDGs, they break it down into individual components. But the truth of it is that we cannot achieve these SDGs separately. And one of the things that science has begun to learn in the last 30 or 40 years is analysing things down into their fundamentals actually loses data, information and structure, which is why we've now moved on from that kind of science to complexity science and complexity thought. And in a way, what that says is You cannot resolve these important human questions, societal questions, even scientific questions, by splitting everything apart, but rather by the more complex process of bringing things together and working together on them. So I think this, and I think for all of us, whether it's in science, whether it's in theology, whether it's in biology, or whether it's in sociology, bringing things together and looking at them from through a complexity lens is the wave front. That's the way forward. And we will not resolve climate on its own, or poverty on its own, or the potential of serious war on its own. And by the way, the SDGs consign conflict of all kinds to SDG 16, right at the tail end, because SDG 17 is only about implementation. So conflict almost didn't get in at all, despite it being the fundamental purpose of the United Nations. We cannot deal with these things without finding a way of working together rather than engaging in conflict. And that's the challenge for all of us as people of faith. We have a history of using our faith in conflict with each other rather than in finding a resolution to our conflicts. And that must be the inspiring thing from all our faith leaders to take us forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Lord Alderdice and to Umar Suleiman for this really thought-provoking fireside chat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lorna and Lord Alderdice and Umar Suleiman. It's the sort of discussion that you don't want to come to an end, and I'm just very sorry we didn't have more time than is available to us today to continue with that. I'm hoping, though, that our discussion now will be equally stimulating. I have the great pleasure, you'll notice, of, in fact, the best part of this job is I get to sit in the SDG tartan chair. If you want to read all about it, there's a placard that tells you all the details over there. I do actually also have a tie in this, but I thought after a reflection that it perhaps wouldn't be a good idea. The internet might crash with visual overload. So, but enough of that. So in my introductory remarks back at the start, ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned some of the events that we at GEFI have been holding over the last 10 days or so, and it's been a constant theme of these, and indeed, I suppose, of the whole of COP26, that unparalleled levels of investment are going to be required if net zero goals are to be achieved and the UN SDGs realized by the target date of 2030. Rather less, I think, has been said about the specifics of where these trillions of dollars are going to come from. So, what we're here to discuss at this session is the extent to which faith-based investment might help to fill that gap. It is an area as a whole, I think, which has tended to be overlooked as a potential financial source. And yet between them, the world's faiths control assets extending to many billions of dollars. We've heard several times this morning already as to the sheer size of the faith world. They can also, I think, claim to have a unique depth of soil, if you like. There are centuries, and millennia in some cases, of thinking about questions of how resources can be deployed for good, what it means
or what our obligations rather should be to others and to life as a whole. And after all, significant proportions of the ethical finance world can trace their origins back to various faith traditions. We heard from Lord Wallace about the Reverend Henry Duncan and the Savings Bank movement as one example. There is, though, I think, also the important caveat that different faiths don't always, of course, reach the same conclusions. And it shouldn't be assumed that what might seem a fundamental concept to certain faiths, I think perhaps an example might be stewardship, which has been referred to once or twice today, necessarily has the same resonance, as it were, by others. So this is definitely not an area where one size fits all, and we have to remain conscious, I think, of that. So our earlier speakers have been very helpful in setting out some of the background there. In this discussion, what we're hoping to do is to move on to look at what is happening in practice in various of the world's faiths and what further developments and indeed challenges we may see in the future. My team of panelists here today are exceptionally well placed to provide us with insights on these issues. I'm delighted Lorna has been agreed to stay on to move into a commentating role from our partner organisation FaithInvest. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Eric Sukumaran, who prior to his present role at the University of Oxford's Said Business School was himself an investment banker. I hope I'm not giving away any secrets there, Eric. Then we have Geraldine Burnett from Gatehouse Bank. And finally, Azman Mokhtar on my left, who for many years was the managing director of Khazanah, the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia. So I'm conscious that our time this morning is limited, and I'm hoping we can spend as much of it as possible on looking at future opportunities for stimulating faith-based investment. But to get the ball rolling, perhaps I could ask each of you in turn briefly just to introduce yourself and give an indication of what your involvement has been in the world of faith finance. Lorna, would you like to start?
So I should probably say I'm not a banker. I'm not an asset holder. I work for
Scoring points already.
I work for FaithInvest, and I also am the chair of the Laudato Si movement, which is a Catholic movement with the simple aim of bringing the vision of Pope Francis in Laudato Si on care for our common home to life. So there is let's say, a quiet revolution, I would say, happening within the Catholic Church at many different levels. And a big part of that involves thinking through what this message of Laudato Si, which calls on all of us to look at the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, to answer that cry, what that means in terms of our investments. The Catholic community as a whole makes up the largest subset of faith-based asset owners that have divested from fossil fuels. 307 Catholic institutions have divested. And there's a great thirst within those communities, those asset owners, to understand how do we reinvest our assets in solutions. And we can see that happening via impact investing collaboratives. The Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is working with religious orders in particular. The USIG, the Confederation of Religious Orders, now looking at how they shift their investments into ESG funds and into impact investing as well. On the horizon, we have a significant step change happening, hopefully in the next 6 months with the Catholic Church. The Church, the Vatican, together with Laudato Si movement and 200 partners, is announcing an action platform, global action platform on Laudato Si, which will include a significant element of training for faith-based, Catholic-based asset owners on how you connect your investments and your the vision of Laudato Si. So we're looking at a very significant step change in the coming 6 months with this action platform.
Well, thanks very much. That's, I'm sure there's lots more to talk about on that. Eric, over to you.
Thanks. Eric Sukumaran, hello. I'm here on behalf of the Oxford Faith-Aligned Impact Finance Project. So over the last 8 months or so, we have been doing some initial work into what is the map of faith capital around the world, or to the extent that that can be identified. We have tried to make it as pan-religious as possible, and also to what extent is that faith capital already deployed in impact creation. And so we're finding several things. First of all, there is a lot of faith capital, and I mean, Graham said many billions. The real answer is you can catalogue trillions of dollars around the world in basically publicly identifiable assets, in funds, in sovereign wealth funds, and we're talking in terms of specifically identified impact creation money, you know, in the low single digits in terms of percentage of that total wealth. So that's one thing. The other thing that we are finding is that, and one of the reasons I used impact creation, impact finance versus impact investing, is that especially, but not exclusively, between the Abrahamic faiths and Dharmic faiths in particular, there's a very stark difference in the attitude towards intentionally creating impact. So on the one hand, we have, you know, here are religious rules, religious guidelines on how to invest your money and how you might create impact that way. But on the other hand, you have, for example, we were talking to a Jain organization recently who said, look, we are taught that an unlimited amount of anything is harmful and greed leads to violence. Philanthropy for us helps limit our wealth. It's one of the things that we must limit. So if we look to make any kind of return or profit out of the activity that we are doing to create impact, then we are contradicting our own faith principles. And so then philanthropy becomes a religious imperative around impact creation. So we are looking at both, okay, well, what is philanthropy doing in that space? And what is impact investing doing in that space? And what do those two areas have in common? How could they work together? What does it look like right now? And then we are also doing some very useful things like collating everything that we can find that exists and making it publicly available in one place, looking at what kind of training is available right now and what could be provided in the future. And we'll be, you know, presenting and publishing it all very soon. But so that's the kind of key takeaways. There's a lot of money. It does feel like, as you do the research, that we're on the verge of all of this increasing because of, for example, Islamic banks, of which we've catalogued assets in sort of $1.5 trillion alone, starting to, especially in Malaysia, but also in the GCC countries, starting to not only look at CSR, ESG, zakat as their way of creating impact, but also how are we embedding responsible, sustainable decision-making across our entire business. And so if I did this project in 5 years' time, I think there would be a marked difference. So it's a very exciting time to be cataloguing it. And I hope to maybe do that again to sort of show how things, I think, are really about to improve in quite a big way.
Well, thanks very much. I think there's much more to hear about, I think, on that. And I think you make an interesting point about, in this sector, the way that impact investment and philanthropy shade into each other and the relationship of that within the whole faith finance world. Geraldine, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Geraldine. I'm here on behalf of Gatehouse Bank. We are a fully Sharia compliant British bank, and Sharia principles underpin our operations and our product offering. And we see a real natural alignment between the principles of Sharia and the UN SDGs. And in 2019, we became the first Islamic bank to be a founding signatory to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. So we are really looking at ways to demonstrate how our Sharia principles and our exclusion list and our screening of investments and the fact that we seek to balance and share risk and reward, the avoidance of high-risk financial transactions and the requirement that all of our investments are based on tangible assets, sort of mitigate some of the negative effects of those high-risk financial products. And we're really seeking to show how that aligns with the UN SDGs and illustrating that it's relevant, to the international development and all the things that we do there. And we're also really focused on climate action. So I think traditionally Sharia compliance is really focused on the S in the ESG, but certainly from our side, although our screening does not currently involve the green for Sharia compliance, our internal Sharia team absolutely sees green action as completely aligned with the Sharia compliance. So we started measuring our carbon footprint in 2020. We're now a carbon neutral organisation, and we are looking at our home finance portfolio now, and we're tracking the path to net zero there, setting climate targets in that space, and we see there's a real need and a role for Islamic banks to play in tackling climate change.
Thanks very much, and you're right to bring the focus to the SDGs, which is what we're here to mainly talk about. Asman, over to you. Eric's already touched on Malaysia, so perhaps you can pick that one up.
Yeah, thank you, Graham and Jeffy and everyone. First of all, I'm sorry I got a rather bad cough. And I should declare, last night my wife and I tested negative. So, nowadays you have to declare every time. I ran Khazanah, as what Graham introduced. Khazanah means treasure. Khazanah National means national treasure in about 12 languages around the world, including Malay, but also Arabic, Urdu, several African languages and so on, right? So basically we were the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia. Along the way, some people called us a sovereign development fund. In many ways, it reflected our own conception when I started back in 2004, a belief, a faith that the economy is a stakeholder economy and not just a shareholder economy. It was a bit lonely back in 2004 because you were kind of swimming against the tide and the strong wave of shareholder value, because 2004 was before the big 2008 global financial crisis of Lehman. So we started talking about building through value, and through value we define as, of course, financial value. We were investors of a commercial nature. We managed to more or less post a 10% per annum return, risk adjusted, which is, we think, pretty good. We basically trebled the portfolio in that period of 14 years. But a second conception was an economic value, which we tried to define what does this mean in terms of jobs, good jobs, in terms of access of opportunities, and so on and so forth, right? But it also meant the third conception of value was what we call societal value, which involves, for example, certain public or quasi-public goods like public education. How does a sovereign fund like us use blended finance, use sukuks, and so on to deliver that, right? Over the years, the tagline building through value, some clever people in my group started calling it, boss, you're trying to build through values as well. So you build through value, through values. And indeed, this is at the heart of what we do. I retired about 3 years ago after a 14-year stint, which is a fairly long time in public or quasi-public office. Since then, I'm here today as a member of JEFI, but also as the chairman of the International Center for Education and Islamic Finance, which is a university that was established in Malaysia to further Islamic finance by our central bank 15 years ago. And I think it's fair to say, I suppose Malaysia's at, quite as Eric and others have mentioned, at the frontiers of what we try to push on Islamic finance, which, by the way, estimated assets is $2.5 trillion US, which may sound a lot, but I think there's some estimates, well, this number could go apparently, according to a JEFI report, to 3.8 trillion in 2022. That's enormous growth. But that 3.8 trillion, at last count, I think is still about 1% of global financial assets. Only 1%, or slightly under even. So I'm here today to learn, but also to share, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and particular thanks for all you've contributed to JEFI as well from your considerable and really unique experience. I think now, for the benefit of the audience, I think what I'd like to do is to try and look at the current scene in a little more detail, and perhaps we could just talk about some specific examples of faith-based investment in action in this territory. Lorna, from your work with Laudato Si, are there some ongoing projects that are up and running you could speak to us about, or give us an example of?
Yeah, I think the most relevant project to this discussion is the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative. So that was a small organisation, and again it comes back to this question of, well, in the Gospels Jesus talks about new wineskins. And are we at a point with the financial system and the investment world that we need to be creating the new wineskins in order to create the types of investments that we need to see? So the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is an organisation set up to bring together the religious orders to really to look at shifting the dial on impact investing. And there are some really powerful examples, such as the Cabrini sisters in the United States and the impact investing that they've been doing in relation to climate change. The Dominican sisters, who announced last year that they were moving significantly into supporting very grassroots climate justice work in the global south. And what we're finding is that, and working predominantly in like local rural-based renewable energy, there is an issue that's, I guess, coming up within the Catholic world. These funds are relatively small. In global finance terms, we're in low numbers of millions of dollars. The costs of setting these funds up is relatively high for the faith investors. And we are really facing a situation where we're looking at a world in terms of the faiths, the Catholic faith, that has been dominated by charity. There's a whole sector of Catholic charities that are grant-based and working with communities. And the big work that is going on within the Catholic community is to look at where it's relevant, where it has a significant impact, how you can bring an investment lens onto some of that grant-based work without undermining the work. And that's the real challenge, I think, in a sense of it can be very impactful. If you bring that investment lens, the work that the likes of the Franciscan Sisters of Mary have been doing in the United States has demonstrated in the area of social housing, that you can scale, the scalability is significant when you bring an investment lens into rather than a charity lens. That's the biggest significant impact, that you can achieve much more with the same amount of capital. But it is slightly, I think there are many issues that need to be addressed through a dialogue, I feel, with the Catholic and the Christian charities to look at how you work together to ensure that you don't land people really experiencing climate injustice in debt through the selection of the wrong partners, that this is something that really contributes to scaling up impact, especially in the Global South.
Thanks. And that brings us back to the question of the interaction between investment and philanthropy that we touched on before, and the point you raised, Eric, about how different faith traditions view that. Maybe you could say a little about the specific examples that have come forward in the project that you're currently running and that have some involvement as well with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll mention the sort of the Catholic-based case first, because I think it sort of dovetails very nicely with what I was talking about. But on the point of the different orders of sisters in the US, we've picked up a lot of that as well in our research, and it's really extraordinary how it's done in as you're saying, small numbers and incredibly disaggregated. But we have this huge long list of them, and we found an example of actually of some of them coming together and pooling their resources with the Religious Community Investment Fund, which does sort of these micro interventions both in sort of emerging markets and in the United States, and it's really extraordinary work. But sort of financial data is very hard to come by with them, and at a next stage I'd love to be able to sort of investigate that more, because I think there really is a lot of scope there to set out examples of collaboration and scaling. I think that's really but yes, on that on top of all the sort of different things that we find, we're also publishing sort of 3 more involved cases across different faiths. So one of them is focusing on the catalytic capital provided by Good Energies, who was a Catholic-inspired foundation operating under the sort of Porteous and Brenninkmeier umbrella. So they made an investment grant to Charm Impact, which is a startup that's come out of the University of Oxford. They make microloans in emerging markets to businesses that want to install solar energy to run their businesses, and that has 2 impacts. Number 1, obviously they don't have to use incredibly polluting generators, and secondly, it brings down their price of power incredibly from 35 cents a kilowatt hour to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Really, really transformational, and allows them to expand. And it provides, thanks to the first loss capital that Good Energy has provided, it allows the interest rate at which these loans can be provided, and small loans, $10,000, $30,000, and they're scaling up the size of these loans. They can be offered at around 7.5 and 8%, as opposed to north of 25%, which is essentially not available credit. It's just what is available to them, and it's entirely impact focused. They want the money to be recycled, so there's a really great takeaway there, where the money that went into Charm is lent out, it's paid back, it's lent out again, and you have this kind of cyclical approach to lending as well that's being approached. But what this now does is it's catalytic. It has allowed Charm to increase the size of its lending, but also establish a track record showing that the risk models that external investors have been using aren't necessarily correct, right? Instead of pricing the risk at 25%, they're showing, 99%, 98, 99% debt repayments at 7%, at 8%. Now, there's still challenges on the scale, but we've got here sort of faith-aligned capital allowing a demonstration of a different way of approaching this. And so there's a very exciting next stage for them now. They've just, thanks to that, they've raised close to £500,000 of seed capital, and they're already going for Series A, and so that's very exciting and a very good outcome. So that's one sort of concrete example of how faith-aligned capital can show the way. Second one, completely different. We go back to Khazanah and the Izan Sukuk. So Sukuks are sort of Islamic bonds, and Khazanah had for some time been in financing out of its own revenue a program to transform schools in Malaysia. So schools in the public system that were perhaps using sort of kind of very outdated principles of teaching, rote learning and a sort of different kind of school culture and parental involvement. They decided to issue a sukuk, the proceeds for which went into stable 5-year funding in the for transformation of 40 schools, about $20 million altogether. And what makes the sukuk different is, so sukuks aren't debt issuances. You have your periodic payments out of the profits generated in the investment, essentially, very simplified. But in this case, the returns to investors were essentially given out of Khazanah's own investment income generation. And the terms of the sukuk had key performance indicators for the schools. And if the schools met them, the principal that was given back to investors was cut by 6%. And that money could then be used again to reinvest in school transformation. The first sukuk term has now ended. It was given out in 2 tranches. It was full take-up and very successful. The schools met their KPIs, and so now there's more money from the fact that the principal being paid back was reduced to investors, to invest in schools. So again, we have a kind of a cyclical approach to lending and finance. And the third one is completely different because it's philanthropic. And again, it's to highlight the philosophical differences around impact creation. So there's a family in India who decided to launch what's called a liberal arts university. So universities in the UK and in India are very subject specific. You go in and you study one subject for 3 or 4 years. Universities in America, you study loads of subjects until you concentrate on a major for your last couple of years. And that's not common in India at all, but this Jain family, which founded one of the biggest investment banks in India, decided to spend $100 million and found a university called Flame University. It now has 3,000 students and a campus. The impact focuses on scholarships for people who would not otherwise have been able to go to university, the impact on the local economy in Pune. And as I was saying before, the reason that it's philanthropy is because generating a return on it would be seen as immoral when they want to create impact. And so we've sort of discussed the religious foundations of both why they want to do liberal arts, the idea of looking at many different viewpoints, and while also understanding your own principles, and the fact that the university will be debt-free essentially forever, and they underpin that. So those are the sort of the big 3.
Well, that's super. That's given us a very broad range of the sort of thing that's going on, which is extremely helpful. I'm conscious of our time going on here. Geraldine, maybe could you just briefly give us an example?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick example of something that we're doing. I touched briefly on it before, which is aligning our home finance portfolio. Home finance is a Sharia-compliant mortgage portfolio with the Paris Climate Agreement. And to achieve that, we've taken estimates of the emissions of all of the homes in our portfolio, and then we're working with environmental consultants to sort of outline the path to take that portfolio from where it's at now, the baseline of emissions, to net zero alignment with the 1.5 degree warming by 2050. And I guess one of the really interesting things about this is they've created, we've worked together to create sort of different scenarios that might get us to net zero. And there are different levers that will help us achieve that. You've got the growth of the portfolio, we've got the activities that we can take as a bank, and then there's market forces, things like uptake of solar panels or air source heat pumps. And one of the key things there is, to create a more energy efficient portfolio of homes, we'll need to be able to support our customers to, say, maybe take extra finance to install solar panels on their roof or re-insulate a bit, more efficient insulation for their homes. There's currently not a Sharia compliant mechanism to do so. So at Gatehouse Bank, we're working out how can we create, not only align our home finance portfolio with the path to net zero, but then also create those mechanisms where we can support our customers to make their homes more energy efficient in a Sharia compliant way. And I think there's a lot of space there to develop equivalent to mainstream financial products that are Sharia compliant, and a real sort of commitment from our Sharia team internally at Gatehouse Bank.
Thanks very much. I might just hold off on a second if I could, because I think we've already had an example that really comes from your sector exactly, that Eric has perhaps slightly pinched from you there. So I'm conscious of time running out, and there's one gentleman here who's very keen to ask a question, so I think we should have that.
Thank you much, Graham. I'd like to give some oxygen to the word risk, which I think we heard just near the end of this. Pick up Lorna's point about dialogue and suggest one focus for that dialogue. I'm an evangelical Christian actuary who roams the world of finance doing stuff, and in the late 90s I helped an Islamic scholar set up a Sharia product for distribution through an Islamic bank, so I have a foot in a few camps. I think we investors are in the world of strategic risk management. I suggest faiths are in the game of strategic risk management through their own particular view of risk. I think you can see the SDGs through the lens of strategic risk management. So slightly challenging Lorna's public-private partnership. Don't just see it as money flows, think it as public-private risk sharing, and I think you get to a better place. Challenging one size does not fit all. Well, maybe, but if we think of risk as the one size fits all which bridges faith and finance, I just offer you strategic risk management as something we might want to think a bit more about. I'm very happy for any responses the panel have, and thank you.
Now, would anyone like to comment on that? Perhaps, Asman, would you have any thoughts?
I don't have much to argue. I think we should manage risk, but perhaps to add to that perspective, from the field I'm coming from, representing today, Islamic finance is actually very much about aligning risk and reward. The whole point why I believe what Omar mentioned around the prohibition of riba or money lending is you get a fixed return without the associated risk. That's a form of financial oppression. That's a form of financial oppression. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there's two versions of the root word of risk. I believe one is Greek, because I researched this before, and the other is actually Arabic. The word comes from risky. Risky means provision, actually. There is no reward without risk. The issue is, of course, what kind of risk that you take. And as we know, in the field of investment or finance, it's about getting a fair return for the amount of risk that you take. The problem with the financial world today is the game is rigged, as we know. I think this is, I used to work in investment banks in my defense as a head of research in investment research. But I'm afraid my children, our children, well, they make their choices, but I don't want them to enter the current form of finance. We do live in financial times. So certainly, strategic risk management is very much part of the equation.
Thanks very much. I'm very conscious we're nearly running out of time. Could we have kind of one sentence each? What I'd like to ask the panel is, what do they see as the biggest barriers, the biggest challenge for really mobilising a greater amount of investment in the ESG world from the faiths? Do you want to pick that up?
I think the biggest challenge we face, well, there's two. I think the first is the challenge of joining the dots in a meaningful way between the principles and values that we've discussed this morning, Lord Wallace discussed so well, put before us, joining the dots between those and the crisis that we're facing today. A reverend on Monday evening at the Interfaith Vigil at the start of COP said something, I didn't catch his name, but he said something that struck me. He said, we need to start to live as if we believed that God created this world and it's worth saving. It really kind of grabbed me. I think you could substitute the word live with invest. And I think once we've done that, the biggest challenge we then face is the fact that we have institutions, faith institutions, that have effectively outsourced the management of their money and their investments to others who do not adhere, perhaps, maybe I'm getting into the kind of preaching side of things, but who we need to question whether those who are managing the money share those deepest values and how we can move to address that.
Eric?
Okay, so I also have two. So the first one I would say is perhaps sort of the official conclusion of the project research, and the second one is sort of my interpretation of it, both from sort of a finance background and the research itself. So the first one I would say is the lack of knowledge. We don't know what is happening within our structures, within different faith structures, and therefore we're not learning from each other enough or fast enough to be able to implement some solutions that are already sort of there. I would say that's probably sort of one big lesson, and the more there's dialogue like this, and the more that different principles can come together to see, well, what is it that we have in common? What can we actually agree on to work on? A lot of trust can be built from that. So that would essentially be one conclusion. And the other conclusion from that is I think there are a lot of structural incentives that are not conducive to this happening quickly. Some of the big pension funds are saying outsourced money being managed, religious money being outsourced and managed, saying, we have a number, we're going to hit it, we need to hit it, and that's essentially that. And if your impact investment fits that model, maybe we'll do it. And that isn't the fault of the person telling me that. That is a structural incentive. And that's something that, and there are tax incentives too that can be changed. And that's something that we need to kind of fix within the global architecture of the financial system that would then allow a lot more of this to flow quickly.
Thanks. Yes, I think your point about the dialogue there is exactly what we were trying to get at in the setting up the Edinburgh Finance Declaration and the work that went on with that. Geraldine, just briefly, if you could.
Yeah, sure. I think a big piece is for us raising awareness and engagement with the Islamic banking community to really illustrate that what we do fundamentally is aligned with the UN SDGs and can include environmental considerations. So I think, for instance, only 3 fully Sharia-compliant banks are signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, and I think that really needs to change. And the more banks that join sort of international frameworks like that require quantitative impact measurement, setting targets, the more Islamic banks can really join sort of global movement and learn from peers and sort of follow a framework to really align themselves even further with the UN SDGs.
Thanks, yes, and that's work actually that Jeffy's involved in to try and increase the number of Islamic banks in particular that are signed up. And then Asman, if you could
I was about to introduce, so I'll end with it instead. I think as my wife and I was driving up the M8 to this beautiful building here today, blaring on the radio was Madonna singing, "We live in a material world and I'm a material girl." So I said, wow, this is quite profound. You know what, she's quite right. Of course, Madonna itself is kind of appropriated, maybe not very appropriately, since I'm coming to a faith gathering. So my conclusion and hope, I suppose, is how are we going to do from after Glasgow the path to sustainability in terms of both environment and society? There are 5 main levers, very briefly, Graham. One is markets, so there's a lot of talk about carbon tax and carbon price. But markets need to be governed, so market governance, I'll just park that. Second is regulations itself, so some form of state governance, whether rules, regulations. Third, science and technology. We heard through the Scottish showcase, amazing stuff being done using technology, and I'm sure. But as we know, science, again, is quite agnostic. It really depends on, you can do it for good or bad. Fourth is finance. And finance, we are here in Glasgow. Adam Smith was the professor of moral philosophy, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Glasgow. So I said, we got to go back to Adam Smith, who locates the economy within the context of a moral economy. But I'm with my faith brethren and sisters here. We should go back further to Adam Smith, to Adam himself, our common forefather. Basically, and all in our tradition, the Islamic tradition, the seal of the prophets, including Jesus and Moses and so on, is Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Muhammad said, even if this is the last day and you have a sapling in your hand, plant that tree. Plant that tree. And Malaysia, we are thankfully actually 60% Muslims, not 100%, not 90%. So that means whatever ideas we put through on Islamic finance is a contested and a collaborated space actually with dharmic religions, Hindus and Buddhists and so on and so forth. And you have to find that middle path to put it all together. But finance also, at the heart of it, needs governance. And I'll end on basically how do we reclaim all of the above. It's about leadership, and we really need to put back morality, or indeed, if you want to call it ethics, back into governance. And the only governance or human governance that I know that really works is actually through faith. And for those of so-called non-faith, I think they're also faithful people in different ways, which I'm sure many of you will know better. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a super summary of a lot of the issues that we're here to talk about in a very brief time. I'm very conscious that we've run a bit late, but I'm equally aware that these are such important issues, and we want to hear all we can from these people while we have the opportunity. So can I ask you to thank the panel, ladies and gentlemen. And we're not yet finished because last but not least, we have another keynote speech from Mr. Martin Palmer, the CEO of FaithInvest, who we're delighted to have with us. I'm not going to say any more than I know very well that this is going to be a treat because Martin is an inspired and inspiring speaker. So no pressure at all, Martin, and we look forward to hearing from you.
No. Oh, I think I'm on now. Very good. Thank you very much indeed for, well, it's been a fascinating morning, quite apart from anything else. My granny was a Glaswegian, and she always said the best thing that ever came out of Edinburgh was the 519 train. And I hope it's all right in Glasgow to make a comment about the physical layout of Edinburgh that tells us a huge amount about the relationship between faith and finance. If you look at the new town, which was designed essentially to show the union between Scotland and England and Wales. The heart of it is that huge area bordered at one end by St. George's Square, at the other end by St. Andrew's Square. And if you look at the original plan, there was going to be a huge church of St. George, that's there, and there was going to be a huge church of St. Andrew at the other end, which isn't there. It's the Bank of Scotland. St. Andrew's Church is kind of squeezed into the sort of road coming off it. And I think that captures a little of the tension that we have had culturally between finance and between faith. And I love the story that Lord Wallace told of Reverend Henry Duncan. But as he pointed out, he struggled. He struggled. And I think in terms of the world of faith and finance, we are at the beginning where we're beginning to sketch out where the arguments will be, where the struggles will be, although there are some very exciting things that are happening. But I've been asked to talk about what is going on. And I want to point to a quote from Confucius. I'm a China scholar. I translate classical Chinese because, well, somebody has to. And there's a quote in which he says, first of all, practice what you want to preach. And then preach about what you're already doing. And Umar picked up on this and said, it's about what we do. It's about what we're actually going to make different that matters. And FaithInvest had quite a role in helping to develop the multi-faith statement issued by the Pope and some 40-plus religious leaders on October the 4th in Rome. And I've been involved with COPs since Kyoto, back in the 90s. And there have been hundreds of faith statements, multi-faith statements, issued to the good, the great, and the not so good, and the not so great who attend these events. And nobody has paid the slightest bit of attention. Absolutely no attention at all. Because from the faith perspective, we've said, now, this is what we'd like you to do, and you really should notice there's a crisis, and please pay attention to what, please do what we ask, and by the way, you shouldn't be doing that. And the first half of that statement issued on October the 4th is in that vein. But the second half marks a fundamental shift. And that fundamental shift is that the second half says, and this is what we are going to do as faiths. And the major paragraph in that second half is we are going to look at our assets, and we're going to move those assets. We're going to use those assets, not just investments. The faiths own 8% of the habitable surface of the planet. 5% of commercial forestry is owned by faiths. Another 15% of the surface of the planet is considered sacred. We may not own it, like the Taoists in China no longer own their sacred mountains, but because they're sacred, the biodiversity there is far higher than on any other mountain level. So we have assets, we have buildings. We've already heard about putting solar panels into churches. And I love the issue that you raised, Lord Wallace. What do you do with a medieval Gothic church? You can't really put a full ceiling in order to contain the heating. But maybe there are other ways that we can do this. My church that I go to, a little country one, we had a heating system put in the 1880s. We sold all the metal in the 1950s to pay enough money to repair the roof. So, we have to make choices as to what we're going to do with the limited resources we have and with the history that we've been given. So this second half of the multi-faith statement is a shift. And it's a shift because of the work of many people in this room, a shift that has come about by saying, let us remember that actually we are stakeholders. We run 50% of all schools, 64% of all schools in sub-Saharan Africa, according to UNICEF. We run a third of all universities, and we've just heard from Eric about the wonderful new one in India. We run more than a third of all medical facilities. And yet we have behaved as faiths, as though our only role was to preach and to point a finger and tell people what we were against. We have failed, and Lord Alderdice made this point. If 80 to 85% of the world's population are believers, I mean, being an Anglican, the word believer is a little bit of an iffy phrase, frankly, because we're not entirely sure what we believe in, and we certainly hope nobody will ever ask us. But so please don't. It would just be so embarrassing at this point in the morning. So if we have, let's say that we've got 40% of that 85% is actually doing something because of what they believe, well, my God, we've been an abysmal failure. And yet we have these assets. We've behaved as though somebody else was in charge of money. Somebody else was in charge of education. Somebody else was in charge of inspiring. Somebody else was in charge of media. No, it's us. That's the shocking thing. It's us. And I think the other issue here too is, and this has been touched on, is that climate change is not the greatest crisis facing us. That wonderful phrase from Gus Speth that was quoted by Lord Wallace. Climate change is a symptom of the malaise, as is biodiversity loss, as is social injustice. And to focus only on one and to think that if you can solve that bit, you've solved the rest, is to miss the point. And that's, again, where faiths go deeper. We know that the problem is us, and that we need to be making those changes. I think also, and Eric raised this, different models. Not all faiths do believe in stewardship. In fact, not all forms of Christianity believe in stewardship. In the Orthodox Church, the model of our relationship is that we are the priests of creation. We are here simply, yet gloriously, to be the channel of grace to all of creation and to give the praise of all creation back to the Creator. We are called, in other words, to be a blessing, which is a very different notion. And I want to tackle that one briefly with regards to the SDGs. We were asked, in my previous organization I set up with Prince Philip, called the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, we were asked by the UN to coordinate the major meeting between the faiths and all the sections of the UN on the SDGs. And I think, as so often happens when a secular group discovers religion, is they really just wanted us to be jolly useful, cheap labor, and a nice, convenient way of getting a moral message out without any sense that it might be something to do with them. God forbid that it would actually mean they had to make a change. And so we had this meeting, and I genuinely think they just thought the faiths were going to rubber stamp the SDGs and say, oh, thank you. But you know, it's amazing, we never thought about education before, or health, because we've only been doing that for the last couple of thousand years. Yeah, that's really revelatory that we might make a difference with that. That's fantastic. We certainly are challenged by issues around gender. Let's be frank, that's a huge glaring area for us. But it was best summed up, the tension between the faith perspective and the UN's perspective, by one of our Muslim colleagues, a wonderful woman called Hajat, who said the problem with the SDGs is it's like going to IKEA and buying a table in order that you get the manual on how to put it together. Rather than that you go to IKEA to buy a table around which for the rest of your lives and your children's lives and your grandchildren's lives, they will sit and they will share food and they will cry and they will celebrate and they will argue and they will resolve things. In other words, it's relationships, not management. And we have allowed ourselves to be seduced into the idea that the faith relationship with the rest of creation, of which we are a part, not apart from, is management. It's not. It's relationships. I remember a wonderful nun in Zambia saying, Martin, there are 4 relationships. There's your relationship with the divine, however you understand that. There's your relationship with your neighbor. There is your relationship with the rest of creation, and there is your relationship with yourself. That's what faiths bring, is relationships into all this. And that's why in the work that FaithInvest does, we're basically saying to each faith, as we're also doing with the Faith Plans program, which we're doing with WWF, and which very much tied up with Lorna and the program on the Loud Out AC Action platform. We're saying, go back recover what it is that you actually believe. What are the core tenets of what you believe? What is the relationship that lies at the heart of your faith? From that, what are the values that come from that? Then in what way are you implementing those values within the structures of your faith about how you manage your role as stakeholders? And then then the next stage is, what is it that therefore you don't do? And having worked out that, then work out what it is you want to do. As faiths, we're very good at telling people what we're against. We're not so good at telling people what we're for. And we're not very good at then saying, therefore, if you wish to be faithful, this is how you should be living. And the Faith Plans program, which we're delighted so many of you here are involved with, is basically saying to each faith, dig deep, go back to your roots in order to discover why you exist. And then look and see whether those roots still feed you in any way. And I want to finish, before I say a thank you, as Omar has asked me to do that on behalf of all of us, the whole issue of risk. We have a wonderful Singaporean colleague called Melvin. And Melvin's point is this. He has faith. He's a very devout Christian who works with many different faiths. And when someone said, and what does faith mean to you? He said, I spell faith, R-I-S-K, risk. And I think one of the things, and Eric has touched on this already, one of the things that working with other faiths does is that we must drop the idea that if only everybody could agree, we'd have a happier world. We've tried that. It doesn't work. I've been working as a theologian with the environmental movement for many years, and one thing I've learned is that God, through evolution, loves diversity. Without diversity, we wouldn't have overcome the problems we've had over the last 500 million years. Well, if God loves diversity in creation, do you know, I honestly think that she might actually quite like diversity in how we function and think, that it isn't all about one answer. The future is pluralistic. The future is diversity. The future, therefore, is immensely risky, but probably less risky than one group thinking that if only everybody agreed with them, there will be a better place, and burning the ones who don't agree with them. So our work in FaithInvest is to say, come proud of your own traditions, but humble enough to listen. And that, I think, is the secret of how we as faiths can work together with our assets, taking seriously our stakeholder role. And with that, my dear beloved friend, Omar, who frankly is just one of the most extraordinarily interesting people I've ever met, has very kindly asked me if I would just say a thank you on behalf of Wahid, Bank, on behalf of GEFI, on behalf of FaithInvest, and particularly on behalf of UK Islamic Finance Council, who are the genesis of all that we're here, including the Edinburgh Statement. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us today. A huge thank you to all of those of you who are listening, and especially a magnificent thank you to the speakers, the chairs, and the contributors, and all those who have made this possible. Ladies and gentlemen, shall we just applaud the lot of them?